In 1875, a cabinet maker in Homer, New York, started building wagons. By 1977, his family's company was producing 25 heavy-duty trucks a day, had a $22.6 million contract with Iran, and 91 dealerships across the United States. Then, its own parent company shut it down. Not because the trucks were bad. The trucks were indestructible. That was kind of the problem. This is the story of Brockway Motor Trucks, the toughest American truck you've probably never heard of. William Northrop Brockway was born in 1829 in Cortland County, New York. He started as a furniture maker and undertaker, which in the mid-1800s was a perfectly normal combination. You built the chairs people sat in during the week and the coffins they eventually ended up in. Brockway was good at both. By 1851, at 22 years old, he was running his own cabinet shop on the corner of Cayuga and Main Streets in Homer. He employed 10 men, turning out bedsteads, tables, chairs, and sofas. Total retail sales of $15,000 a year, respectable money for a small town in the middle of New York State. By 1875, he pivoted to building wagons and carriages. Bought a defunct carriage works on South Main Street in Homer, mostly for its woodworking equipment, figured he'd knock out a few spring wagons on the side. First full year, he built about 100 vehicles. Within a decade, he'd purchased 3 acres of land running along the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, constructed a complex of 13 buildings ranging from 1 to 3 stories tall, and his workforce of 160 men was turning out 2,500 vehicles a year. A 50-horsepower stationary engine powered the main building. The standalone blacksmith shop had 12 separate fires going at once. By the 1890s, the Brockway Company was cited as being the largest carriage company owned by a single person in the United States. His wagons were sold by dealers from New York to Pennsylvania to the western frontier. William died in 1889 at 60 years old. His obituary in the Cortland County Democrat noted that death removed him at the very time when his indomitable energy had triumphed over all obstacles and the enjoyment of wealth seemed at hand. His son George took over at 26. The employees led the funeral procession to Glenwood Cemetery. The plant foreman lowered the coffin into the ground themselves. That level of loyalty from your workers doesn't happen by accident. It tells you everything about how the Brockways ran things. George was smart enough to pay attention to what was happening in the wider world. Horseless carriages were showing up on streets everywhere. Automobile clubs were forming. But George didn't panic, didn't rush into anything. He joined the Syracuse Automobile Club in 1903. He attended meetings, he read the trade journals, he watched the technology mature. For 6 years, he watched. Then, in 1909, he made his move. He reached out to a man named Orrin Chase, a former Franklin automobile engineer who had started his own motor truck company in Syracuse. Chase was a Boston Tech graduate, what we'd now call MIT, class of 1900, with a degree in mechanical engineering. He'd worked at Franklin and the Syracuse Chilled Plow Company before striking out on his own. Chase agreed to supply stripped-down chassis to Brockway. George's carriage builders fitted them with Brockway commercial bodies and shipped them to key dealers along the East Coast. Between 1910 and 1912, they built about 30 of these hybrid machines, basically a horse-drawn wagon with a small gasoline engine and chain drive bolted underneath. They ran, more or less. The important thing was that George now understood the business. In August of 1912, George and his brother-in-law, Fred Thompson, a dentist turned real estate man, leased a factory building in neighboring Cortland that used to belong to the Ellis Omnibus and Cab Company. They incorporated the Brockway Motor Truck Company with $100,000 in capital stock. George recruited Chase's chief engineer, Rodman Reed, who had spent 8 years at Franklin and 4 more at Chase designing truck chassis. Reed would stay with Brockway for 2 decades and eventually serve as vice chair of multiple SAE technical committees. The new company started with about 50 employees, most of them former carriage craftsmen who now had to figure out how internal combustion engines actually worked. The first Brockway to roll off the Cortland assembly floor was a Model A, built for the Miller Corset Company. Yes, a corset company. You start where the orders are. Those first real Brockways had 3-cylinder, 2-cycle, air-cooled engines, 7 moving parts total. Simple enough that a carriage mechanic could keep them running. 4 models, designated A through D, ranging from 1,000 to 4,000 pounds of carrying capacity. 95 trucks built in the first 2 years. Not exactly lighting the world on fire, but they were solid, honest machines, and that reputation for honesty would carry the company for the next 65 years. Here's the thing about Brockway that you need to understand before anything else in this story makes sense. From day one, they were what the industry called an assembled truck. They didn't manufacture their own engines, their own transmissions, their own axles, or their own frames. They bought the best available components from specialists: Continental engines, Bosch electrics, Timken axles, Brown-Light transmissions, Parrish-pressed steel frames out of Reading, Pennsylvania, Champion sheet metal stampings for the hoods, fenders, doors, and cabs, made right in Cortland itself. Then Brockway's craftsmen assembled all of it into something that was genuinely greater than the sum of its parts. Most assembled truck makers were forgettable. Only a handful ever earned real respect. Kenworth and Peterbilt out on the Pacific coast, and Brockway holding down the East. That was the company. Their conservatism was deliberate, and it was their greatest competitive advantage. Brockway almost never changed specifications unless there was a compelling engineering reason. Year after year, the design stayed consistent. Their idiosyncratic backwards-mounted fenders, their hood-top vents, their handsome but unchanging cab profiles. If you ran a fleet of 10 or 20 Brockways with your own maintenance shop, your parts inventory didn't become obsolete every model year. Your mechanics didn't need retraining every fall. The truck you bought in 1952 worked fundamentally the same as the one you bought in 1964. For a highway department or a construction fleet, that isn't boring. That's a business advantage worth real money. And it's why Brockway's customer loyalty and repeat buyer rate was the highest of any truck manufacturer in the entire American market. By 1914, they swapped the finicky air-cooled engines for water-cooled Continental 4-cylinders. By 15, they had David Brown worm drive from England, pressed steel frames, and Rome Turney cast-case fin-tube radiators that came with an insurance guarantee against leaking for the entire life of the truck. Individual tubes could be replaced by anyone with basic tools. The trucks were getting serious. Then the war came. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Brockway became a full-time military supplier. They landed a contract for 1,000 Class B Liberty trucks for the Army. The armistice arrived after 587 were completed. Contract canceled with 413 trucks still unbuilt. George now had a factory full of Liberty truck parts with no government buyer. So he did what any good industrialist would do. He took those surplus military components, redesigned them into a 5-ton commercial hauler called the Model T, and sold them to construction companies and municipalities who needed heavy iron at a reasonable price. After the war, Brockway claimed export business in 65 countries. They also built fire apparatus chassis for American LaFrance, selling budget-priced combination chemical engine and hose cars to small volunteer departments from New Jersey to Colorado who couldn't afford the full-price LaFrance equipment. Through the 20s, steady growth, 8 models by 1922. A bus chassis program with bodies from the Kuhlman Car Company of Cleveland that sold well in the Caribbean and Central America. Trackless trolley chassis for the New York State Railways, running crosstown routes in Rochester and Utica, as feeders to the main streetcar system. George's annual report for '25 showed net income of $703,000, with foreign sales accounting for a full third of the total. The stock was trading on the New York curb market. Production hit over 3,000 trucks in '26, climbing past 3,800 in '27. For a company based in a town with a population under 7,000, that was genuinely remarkable. In '28, Brockway merged with Indiana Truck Corporation out of Marion, Indiana. Combined assets exceeding $9 million, 38 factory branches coast to coast, projected annual sales of $15 million. George stepped aside as chairman. Martin O'Mara, formerly White Motor Company's vice president of Eastern Sales, became president. The first 6 months were excellent. Gross profit nearly $2 million. Sales up 20%, with virtually unchanged overhead. Then the Depression arrived. Brockway was forced to sell Indiana to White Motor Company. O'Mara was indicted in a stock manipulation scheme. The company nearly went under. But Brockway survived. They always survived. By '35, they had 36 models in the catalog, including electric delivery vehicles. They also developed what many consider the first purpose-built sleeper cab for long-haul operations. That was Brockway. The mid-'30s brought the V1200, a brute hauling 15 tons behind a 240-horsepower V12 American La France engine. Sales climbed from 1,245 units in '35 to nearly 1,800 by '39. Not massive numbers. But every one of those trucks was built to the buyer's specific order. No two Brockways were exactly alike. World War II brought military contracts again. Brockway built the B666 heavy truck series, including bridge erector vehicles carrying the Daybrook M2A system and crane carriers fitted with Quickway revolving cranes for combat bridging operations. Their 6-ton 6x6 bridging trucks, built alongside similar units from Corbett and White, used Hercules HXD inline-6 gasoline engines, 855 cubic inches of displacement, 14 liters, 202 horsepower at 2,100 revolutions per minute, 642 pound-feet of torque at just 900 revolutions per minute. Look at that torque number and where it peaks, 900 revolutions per minute. These engines were designed for one thing: low-speed pulling power under extreme load. The kind of grunt you need to haul a Bailey bridge to a riverbank while people are trying to kill you. The G547 treadway trucks had large self-unloading hoists mounted on the rear. Drive to the crossing point, dump your bridge sections, get out of the way. Not glamorous work, essential work. Without these trucks, the pace of the Allied advance through Europe looks very different. After the war, Brockway returned to what they did best. Heavy-duty vocational trucks for customers who needed things moved and didn't care about style. Municipalities across the Northeast, the sanitation departments of New York City and Philadelphia, construction companies, breweries and dairies running regional delivery routes, oil companies, logging operations in Vermont, Maine, and upstate New York. If your town was in the Northeast and a truck cleared your roads after a blizzard, there's a decent chance it wore a Husky on its hood. The customer loyalty was legendary. Fleet operators stayed with Brockway for decades because the trucks barely changed. Your parts department stayed relevant, your mechanics stayed current, your operating costs stayed predictable. That kind of consistency is rare and valuable. But by the mid-'50s, custom building trucks one at a time was getting expensive. The big manufacturers, GMC, International, White, Mack, had assembly line economies of scale that Brockway couldn't match. In August of '56, Mack Trucks bought Brockway. Mack wanted a dedicated vocational truck line. Brockway needed financial backing. For a while, it worked. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. Okay, back to it. Mack brought 2 immediate changes. Cummins diesels replaced Continental gasoline engines as standard power. Detroit diesels were optional. By the 70s, Caterpillar was on the list too. Better power, better fuel economy, and parts available through any diesel shop in the country. The second change was cosmetic, but deeply meaningful. Brockway got its own mascot. Mack had its famous bulldog hood ornament. Brockway needed its own symbol. A young boy named Jim Duncan, son of Brockway employee Bill Duncan, suggested a dog. The kid had been watching a television show called Sergeant Preston of the Yukon and was taken with the Alaskan Malamute sled dogs. Management considered several ideas, including a bull, but the dog won out. In '57, the Husky became official. The first chrome Husky dog hood ornament appeared on a '58 model N260TL. Cortland, New York became Huskytown, USA. The name stuck. It still sticks. Jack Cambria, formerly Mack's vice president, took charge of the Brockway division and ordered the first complete design overhaul since 1935. 24 years without a major restyle. That's how conservative Brockway was. The new Huskies had a squared-off, angular look. Modern, aggressive, unmistakably Brockway. That basic styling carried through to the very last truck. In '65 came the 300 series, and it became the truck Brockway is remembered for. Bumper to back of cab dimensions ranged from 90 inches to 117, accommodating practically any engine on the market. The butterfly hood swung completely open for full, unobstructed engine access. Mechanics loved that. Fenders hinged outward. The fiberglass grille insert made a Brockway identifiable from a quarter-mile away. Then came Husky Drive in '68, a turnkey powertrain package built around a 6-cylinder Cummins NH diesel rated at 248 horsepower, mated to a 5-speed transmission with 2-speed rear ends giving 10 effective ratios. Fleet buyers could order it with confidence, knowing exactly what they were getting. The frames were heavy-gauge pressed steel channel, hot riveted and cross-braced with gussets at every stress point. Riveted, not welded. Riveted joints handle cyclical loading and vibration differently. A weld line can propagate a crack under repeated stress. A properly installed rivet absorbs and distributes force across the joint. For a truck spending its entire working life on logging roads, construction sites, or potholed municipal routes, carrying a full dump body, that's the difference between a frame that lasts 20 years and one that develops a crack at year 8. The cabs used stampings from Champion Sheet Metal Company, a Cortland firm that had been working steel since 1892 when they started making dairy equipment and milk coolers. They knew the material intimately. Brockway offered configurations for every possible heavy-duty application: tandem axle tractors, tri-axle dump trucks, cab-over-engine models for tight urban delivery, fire apparatus chassis, snow plow specials with reinforced frames, cement mixers. If it needed to be heavy, work hard, and absolutely never break down, Brockway built it. By the early '70s, production exceeded 2,000 trucks a year, 25 per day rolling off the Cortland line, 91 dealerships, 9 factory branches. Then, in '75, the biggest single order in company history landed. The Shah of Iran wanted 575 Brockway trucks. $22.6 million, deliverable over 4 years. Distributorships were being established across the Middle East. For a small custom builder from upstate New York, this was supposed to be the moment everything came together. It came apart instead. Several things converged at once, and none of them were survivable alone. The '73 energy crisis had already battered the trucking industry, but Brockway weathered that. The real devastation came from Washington. In '75, the federal government implemented FMVSS 121, mandating anti-lock air brake systems on all new heavy-duty trucks. The technology was not ready. The computerized anti-lock modules were designed to sense impending wheel lockup and modulate brake pressure automatically. Noble idea. In practice, the systems were enormously expensive, frequently unreliable, and the engineering simply hadn't matured enough to work consistently on vehicles weighing 40,000 pounds or more. Customers across the entire industry refused to buy new trucks with unproven brake systems that added thousands to the sticker price. Heavy truck sales nationally fell off a cliff. This wasn't a Brockway problem, this was an everybody problem. Brockway found a workaround. In July of '76, they began offering glider kits, a frame, cab, hood, front fenders, radiator, and front axle. No complete drivetrain. Since FMVSS 121 only applied to finished trucks rolling off the factory floor, a glider kit was technically legal. Customers sourced their own engines and transmissions and completed the build themselves or through a dealer. Clever. But it wasn't a real business model. It was desperation wearing a suit. The truck manufacturers eventually sued the federal government as an industry coalition. They won. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals struck down the anti-lock brake requirement in '78. The technology wouldn't actually become mandatory until the mid-90s, when it had matured enough to work properly. But by '78, Brockway was already gone. Mack itself was bleeding money during this period. And at the Cortland plant, labor relations had deteriorated badly. The UAW Local 68 contract expired at the end of '76. Mack and the union couldn't agree on a new deal. The union rejected an extension of the existing contract. Then, in early January of '77, a wildcat strike erupted without official union authorization. Workers walked off the assembly line after lunch and didn't come back. They eventually returned. But on February 8th, the formal walkout began. Picket lines went up on Central Avenue. On March 30th, 1977, Mack announced the permanent closure of Brockway Motor Trucks. Mack publicly blamed union troubles. The workers blamed Mack, saying the parent company had been slowly strangling Brockway for years. Engineering departments were consolidated around 1970, pulling design work away from Cortland. Investment was redirected to Mack's own product lines. The Cortland plant was treated as expendable, a subsidiary to be milked for revenue, and then discarded when the numbers got inconvenient. Mack reportedly tried to sell the Brockway division. A buyer was identified. The deal collapsed at the last minute. Nobody has ever fully explained why. The very last Brockway trucks were assembled, not in Cortland, but in Miami, Florida, bound for Middle Eastern oil field customers. The factory on Central Avenue went quiet. 800 jobs vanished from a county that couldn't absorb the loss. In a community that size, losing your largest employer isn't a layoff. It's an economic earthquake. It's an identity crisis. For decades, Cortland was Husky Town. Then one morning, it wasn't. 1 year later, the film Convoy hit theaters. Sam Peckinpah directing, Chris Christopherson driving a Mack RS 700 as the legendary rubber duck. There's a scene filmed in Bernalillo, New Mexico, where a white '72 Brockway 361 driven by a character called Widow Woman tips over making a hard left at a four-way intersection. The loaded trailer went first, pulling the tractor over with it. It was a genuine accident on set. Peckinpah kept the footage because it looked too good to waste. In the movie, Widow Woman kicks the fallen Brockway, calls it a piece of junk, and abandons it while the hero rolls on in his Mack. Nobody planned it as a metaphor for what had just happened to the brand, but that's exactly what it became. The smaller company, built by hand in upstate New York for over a century, lying on its side in the dust, while the bigger corporation drove on without looking back. The parallels between Brockway's death and the broader collapse of small-scale American manufacturing in the '70s are hard to overstate. This wasn't just one truck company going under. It was a way of building things, small batch, custom, quality over volume. The kind of manufacturing where a craftsman on the assembly line might know the name of the man who was going to drive the truck he was building. That model couldn't survive in an industry that was consolidating, automating, and cutting costs relentlessly. The same forces that killed Brockway killed Diamond T, killed Autocars Independence, killed dozens of small truck builders across the country. The accountants won. They always do. But the trucks survived. That's the part of this story that matters most. Brockway trucks are still working today, nearly 50 years after the last one left any factory anywhere. Go to rural counties across upstate New York, Pennsylvania, Vermont, or New England, and you'll find Huskies still plowing roads, still hauling aggregate, still doing the job they were built for half a century ago. The parts are getting scarce. The enthusiast community keeps them circulating through swap meets and online networks, but the trucks themselves just keep running because they were built by people who refused to build something that would break. In the year 2000, the city of Cortland was planning its centennial celebration. Somebody on the committee suggested bringing the Huskies home for a truck show. Nobody knew if anyone would actually come. 76 trucks arrived from 6 states. Former employees reunited on Main Street, just a few blocks from where the Central Avenue factory used to stand. They shared stories. They remembered. They've held the show every year since. By 2003, it was drawing entries from 10 states and 2 countries. An Australian Brockway enthusiast named Kermie flew halfway around the world to attend and eventually shipped a 75 Brockway F761 TL, powered by a 475 horsepower Detroit 8V92, all the way back to Australia. The Brockway Truck Preservation Association maintains a museum at the Central New York Living History Center in Homer. Over 140 Huskies typically line up for the annual show each August. Former employees, some in their 80s and 90s, still come. They remember. There's one story that captures everything Brockway ever was. In 1959, 4 volunteer firefighters in Buenos Aires decided they wanted a new fire truck for their station's 75th anniversary. They owned a 1925 Brockway that had been customized into a fire engine. It was 34 years old. Their plan was to drive it from Argentina to Cortland, New York, and ask the Brockway factory to trade it in for a new one. With $650 each for expenses, they set off. They crossed the Andes Mountains. They floated the truck across rivers on log rafts. Their top speed was sometimes 5 miles per hour. The trip took over a year. 17,000 miles in a truck older than most of the roads it drove on. They made it. Brockway gave them their new truck. That 1925 chassis sits in the museum today, covered in messages and tributes from every community that welcomed them along the route. 4 men, a 34-year-old truck, 17,000 miles, and it made it. That's Brockway. You could build them, but you could not kill them. It took their own industry to manage that. And there you have it, Brockway Motor Trucks. From a cabinet maker's workshop in 1851 to Huskytown, USA, to a silent factory on Central Avenue. 102 years of building things that refused to quit, ended by a collision of bad timing, bad regulations, and a parent company that decided the math didn't work anymore. If you've ever seen one of these Huskies on the road, or your family had any connection to the Cortland plant, drop it in the comments. And if you made it this far, go ahead and subscribe. We do this every week.